Morning and welcome to day 2 of the International Humans in Space Summit. My name is Paul Hawkins and I'm co-hosting together with my colleague Melanie Farmer. We've got an action-packed day for you. We're starting off with a wonderful panel. We're going to be talking about all things search and rescue in space, about how to breathe in space. And we're going to have the joy of meeting Australia's first person with disability to go to space on the panel. See if you can guess who that is. And we are then going to move quite quickly into our first session with Charlie Pellerin, who is the mission lead on the Hubble telescope. So we'll hear from him, and also author of How NASA Builds Teams. We're going to be hearing how to breathe in space, which we all need to know and understand. We're going to find out how to grow fish in a petri dish later in the day, and how to preserve fossils on Mars. And then we're going to wrap up the day with a wonderful panel session, which will tell you how to get into space if you're interested in being in and part of the space industry. So a wonderful day and a very exciting lineup for us throughout up until about 4 o'clock this afternoon. I'm going to hand now to the co-founder of International Humans in Space, Dr. Rowena, and Rowena is going to welcome us, do an acknowledgement of country, and introduce us to the panel. Rowena, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here again today. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're gathering today, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and also to any First Nations people with us today. I would also like to give a very warm welcome to the members of our panel today. We have some wonderful and exciting panelists who come from a very wide variety of backgrounds. So we have Dwayned Fernandes from Minds at Play, Professor Bruce Thompson from the University of Melbourne, Dr. Lisa Mazzuca from NASA Search and Rescue, and Cody Kelly, also from NASA Search and Rescue. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts today, and thank you very much for participating. So we'll just start by giving everyone an opportunity to do a short introduction and just tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowena. I'm Dwayned Fernandes. I am a double below-knee amputee, missing a few fingers on my right hand. And I've been wanting to go to space since I was 2 years old. I've been to the Space Center. There's a picture of me and my dad in that cardboard cutout of that EB suit in that dodgy pram. So I've had the same ambition to go into space since I was a kid. And so I've been taking steps towards making that happen with 3 different approaches, being starting a business that will pay for it because there's a commercial way, being an expert in display inclusion and therefore what that means in a zero-G environment, as well as infrastructure for space, and also trying to get a hold of Elon Musk and all those other high important people to get the friend and get me on board, that type of thing. That's high level for me. Over to you.
Thanks very much. It's Bruce Thompson. I'm the head of the Melbourne School of Health Science, and that's at the University of Melbourne. And it's kind of interesting why I'm in some ways here, because I look after nursing and allied health. So I look after everything except medicine at the University of Melbourne, and we don't really do anything in the space environment at all. But my actual background's in respiratory medicine, clinical physiology in particular, and did part of my PhD with Kim Brisk, who's just sitting here, who's going to speak a bit later, at the NASA Physiology Lab at UCSD, and particularly interested in actually, for starters, building a human space health program here in Australia. There's a desperate need for us to do this. Australia needs to be involved, and we have the capacity and the capability as well. So that's our charge to us.
Morning, everybody. I am the chief of the NASA Search and Rescue Mission Office. We work out of Goddard Space Flight Center on the East Coast near Washington, D.C. We really aim to infuse technology, whether it's space-based, ground-based, and emergency beacons, across not just the nation, but the world, where we interface in with this international search and rescue program. It's called Cospis SARSAT. You'll hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We have been working out of this office for over 40 years. So we obviously up until now have been solely focused on terrestrial, but of course we are moving up in altitude and looking to apply search and rescue onto the moon.
Cody Kelly, I'm the National Affairs Manager within the Search and Rescue Mission Office. Lisa covered a lot of what we do. Much like the other panelists, very early on when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut too. But I was diagnosed with diabetes, which prevents me from becoming an astronaut. So I'm very interested in some of the topics we're going to talk about making space accessible for all. My background, I came from the Johnson Space Center for the first several years of my career working on spacesuit design and human physiological responses to survival scenarios for post-landing, as well as some of the neurovestibular effects of long-duration spaceflight on the ability to get out of a spacecraft in the event of an emergency. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to come over and work with Lisa, and we're looking to extend our search and rescue capability to the moon, Mars, and beyond. So look forward to talking today.
Thank you all very much for those introductions. It's really great to know a little bit about what you're all involved with. And one of the lovely things about humans in space is that we do need a huge team of people from different backgrounds to support that effort. And I also look forward to hearing your presentations later on today. So the first thing to talk about is just to think about the whole profile of how humans are exploring space and what the important issues or remaining challenges still facing human spaceflight are if we go from the Earth upwards. So if we think about the suborbital adventure tourism or commercial spaceflight for non-government astronauts as the first stage, then we think about the level of the ISS or orbital flights, then returning to the moon and building a presence there. And finally, long duration space flights such as to Mars and potentially planetary settlements. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about what you think the big issues that we're still facing are. And Cody, since you're holding
it's really convenient. I ended up with the microphone. So, I worked in human spaceflight, and I've worked in it for about 13 years. So I've seen the industry change over time, where you had really a single source of access to low Earth orbit with the space shuttle and Soyuz, and now you have all these commercial companies that are popping up and are really lowering the barrier of entry to the citizen astronaut. So that opens up a wide portfolio of folks that can fly to space, which along with it brings its own physiological and healthcare issues, because now you look at the past, the Mercury astronauts, the Gemini astronauts, Apollo, they were very much cookie cutter of very highly trained test pilot, fit a very specific gender and professional profile. But now we're opening this up to the entirety of humanity, which on one side gives us that insight of a wider ecosystem of people, but then on the backside brings along with it all of those potential medical risks that, and in my opinion, can be mitigated with modern technology, proper training, and those safety features, allowing for citizen science and citizen astronauts. When you start looking at low Earth orbit, NASA has the commercial low Earth orbit program that we're working to put commercial space stations around the Earth. And that's the kind of the next step, allowing for citizen science and citizen astronauts to go perform those long duration space flights. Again, that brings along with it its own medical risks, because spending a year in space with a wide patient population can bring up latent issues with medical care that we have to address from a hardware, screening, and longevity perspective. And then looking at the moon with the Artemis program, and then efforts by the global community to put moon bases in a permanent human settlement. The thing I like to say is we don't know what we don't know about the moon, because the analogy I've always heard is, we've explored basically the Houston Metroplex on a continent the size of Africa. So what's out there beyond that horizon that we don't know that can impact human health, long duration human health? So I'm really excited about the long the lung lecture about moon dust and the effects on the respiratory system, because that's something you're breathing in all the time. And if the lessons from COVID have taught us anything, is the importance of air quality and filtration and elements like that. So maybe there's ways that we can take some of the best lessons we've learned here on Earth and apply them to the lunar domain. And then you look at Mars and beyond, that's where you really become Earth independent, is the term that we always use, where you can't call 911 and call back for help. And you really are looking at expeditionary medicine and self-care, much like the experiences we have in the Antarctic. You know, Australia has a lot of experience with the very large search and rescue regions extending all the way to the South Pole. And that's the kind of medicine you're looking at, where you're really alone and unafraid on the high horizon. So that's why we're trying to work so hard to put a lunar search and rescue as an extendability to Martian search and rescue, so that you can do buddy aid, we call it, and have your fellow astronauts provide medical care and first aid to you when you're out there performing EVAs. And I probably just talked a lot, but that's kind of the full smattering of my answer to that.
Well, thank you for those wonderful insights. And it's always terrific to hear from people like yourself with such long experience on the operational side of things, which we don't have here in Australia. So thank you.
Well, I think it's great that you guys are so focused on that currently in Australia, because you guys are much like NASA was in the early 60s, where you guys are seeing this new emerging ecosystem, and you guys are rising as a nation and as an industry to address that. And in human health and space is such a wide and varied topic that there is still a lot to be explored. Like, all the answers are not out there because they're rewriting the book all the time. So it's very exciting.
Thank you. Lisa.
I guess if I could add to that, I would probably go a little sideways, because Cody has really given a nice overview as you know, how we at NASA are trying to think outside the box and anticipate really the difference between what we're used to seeing as astronauts, and obviously professional astronauts with heavy training on top of all the physiological screening that is needed. That's to help mitigate all the medical side, right? And so when you open that up, it really is us trying to anticipate what the medical needs could be, and then what type of safety net we could put in place ahead of time. So you know, conferences like this are really eye-opening for the technical part of lunar SAR, because we want to make sure we're understanding all of the challenges, certainly medically, to then be able to work it within our emergency beacons. In particular, we can put very specific data in them and transmit out, whether it's to base camp or straight down to the ground, because it really is isolating. Obviously, it's not like the movies. You know, I hate to burst your bubble on that one, but yeah. So you know, it's very hard to anticipate all of the challenges, but we know that they're vast, and we know that we're not going to think of it all until we get there. So having really layman astronauts that start to explore the surface of the moon, anything under that, I think would be gaining experience and knowledge. But once you're on the surface of the moon and you're kind of out there on your own, that's where we're trying to at least act as a safety net to make sure that help is on the way as fast as possible. But that's kind of where we're coming from in general.
Thank you. That's really interesting. The whole idea of bringing emergent care as quickly as possible in that very isolated and remote setting. That's really great to hear about that. This is something I've always wondered about, that if you trip over a rock and break your leg or something and you're quite some distance from base camp, what happens next? So thank you. Oh, Bruce.
So this is just going to be waxing lyrically, because ultimately I really don't know the answer. However, there's a couple of things I've experienced over the years, and I think there's some hard questions that we need to ask. So ultimately, from my understanding, from what you just said, the people who become astronauts are superhuman people. So highly screened, come from a certain professional background, super fit, like just the specimens of the human race. So the right stuff. Yeah, no movies though. No movies, yeah. So so therefore we might need to ask some questions. Who do we allow to go up there? And they're the tough questions. So in the Defence Forces, for example, if you are wanting to enter, say, especially the Air Force, and you get the medical questionnaire, and one of the questions is that, did you have asthma as a child? If you tick that box, you're immediately rejected. You're gone. If you don't tick that box, and you're an asthmatic, and you get fully trained as a FA-18 pilot or whatever it is, and then lo and behold, you have an asthma attack, then you're fine. You can stay in and you'll get the best medical care that the armed forces will provide, which is really, really good. The reason why they don't throw you out is they struck $3.5 million on training you, and it's way cheaper to actually keep you in there and treat you, as opposed to, it's probably best to exclude you at the beginning. So therefore, we got some really tough decisions to make. Who do we going to actually allow to be put up there? And talking about people with accessibility issues, my wife uses a wheelchair. I think it'd be tragic if she wasn't allowed to actually be able to fly. That's not really fair. But then ultimately, what do we do if something goes wrong while we're up there? I was only reflecting on this. So it was going to be 3 or 4 months in a capsule going all the way to Mars and then stuck there. I mean, I was walking down the street at the beginning of this year and had a small bowel obstruction, doubled me over, put me in hospital for over a week. So if that happened out of the blue, what do I do? And Kim and I were talking about last night, people's appendix become inflamed. Do we just pluck them out before you fly? We actually start removing extraneous bits that we don't need that potentially can get infected and all that sort of stuff. Have a bit of a purge of body organs. You don't need both, kidneys, just lose one just in case. So how do we go about it? And these are probably the tough questions of, where do we start drawing the line? What do we just basically open the doors, or do we actually continue with what we're doing? And I'll now hand that over to someone.
Thank you.
Love the can of worms you've opened up. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So where do you draw the line? So my perspective on it is you draw the line where I'm included rather than the other space, right? So high level is that I'm coming up to be doing something called Mission Astral Access in Houston, Texas, on 14th of December. It's about disability inclusion in space. There are 16 people on the zero-G flight, and they're doing experiments around what does disability inclusion look like in a zero-G environment. Now, what I'm personally doing is my experiment is around the social model of disability. And in my mindset, I'm simply doing that equation, right? Disability equals conditions plus barriers. Well, you take away gravity and that changes the barrier. So the question is, do you need legs? Do you need an entire lower limb? We call it the spacewalk, but I don't think anybody actually uses their feet at all, do they? Other than to anchor in. And can anchor in? A hook or a carabiner. I can store these away. And so my experiment is around mobility and coordination in a zero-G environment. And being that spaceflight is expensive, and it's a lot of thrust to get you up there, I'm in theory, a lower cost than your other right stuff. But if you want to talk about longevity in space, if you focus on the disability inclusion community here on Earth, you're going to eliminate issues and increase the longevity of a mission and the success of a mission, because the person who's setting up there is important. They have an essential skill. You're going to need them for a longer period of time. You're not going to put them down like horses over here on Earth, right? So it's not, you don't have that option. You need that skill up there. And so anything that can allow you to increase the length of the mission and the success of the mission, well, if you're sending humans in space, you need to make sure that it's as inclusive as possible, which means that you're dealing with visual impairments, which occurs in space, bone density issues. And people already dealing with medical issues down here on Earth understand their condition enough. So you should send them up there because they know how to manage that already. They know how to have a high level of resilience. At least that's my opinion on it. So.
Thank you very much. And that's wonderful insights to have from your perspective, which of course is a different perspective to what most of us have. So it's very enlightening. Thank you for sharing all of that. And that actually leads very nicely into the second discussion point, which we have today. And I'll just read it out so everyone's aware of what it is. And it goes, especially in the context of humanity becoming a spacefaring civilization, how can we best facilitate access to space for all, particularly when I think about people with disabilities? And Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti once said, "In space, we are all disabled." ESA now has a para-astronaut program, and the first person with a prosthesis flew on the recent Inspiration 4 mission. So what more can we do, or should we be doing? So you've given us a few initial thoughts, but before we pass back the microphone, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Absolutely. So, so things in space. I've been following Haley and her exploits when she got selected for the Inspiration 4 mission and their entire crew. I managed to ask them a bunch of questions on, I think, when Clubhouse was a thing. So I became engaged in speaking to actual astronauts on what they need to do. The issues with barriers with regards to inclusion is that you need to think about it from the fact that you are building a very expensive piece of equipment and setting it up there. All those space stations, all those things out there, you need to make sure you're building infrastructure correctly and doing it once. Because here on Earth, if you do it, you have to retrofit it for my community. And in Australia, we have some really good legislation, the Disability Discrimination Act. You think we're letting you up there without us? I don't think so. And so you will be, if you don't get it right and you're not including us early enough, we have good examples of that here in Australia. In Queensland, they built a train and it was very inaccessible and it cost them, actually, let's play a guess, right? One person in a wheelchair sued the Queensland government to make accessible upgrades to the train. How much do we think it costs to retrofit? How many millions?
Oh, lots.
Yep, tens or
Oh,
hundreds?
definitely high tens, hundreds.
So it was, the initial ruling was $500 million. And so does that shut you down? And the answer is, if it shuts you down for your processes, it was brought down to $350 million after they identified it a bit better. But at $350 million, is that how much it costs to speak to a person with a disability right now? Is pen and paper? Probably not. But if you get it right, what you end up doing is increasing the variety of people going up there. So your P&O space cruises becomes very inclusive for people who are aged with disability. Something like the lunar surface is an invigorating environment for someone with low strength. So you get your vitality back on the moon. If you want the commercialization of space, you would really need to speak to the disability community right now, or it's going to be expensive directly afterwards. That's a high level warning.
Part of I think the biggest hurdle is actually making the decision to do it. And it just needs to be quite clear that this is the pathway we're going to go down. I think of my wife's situation, it would be liberating for her because all of a sudden she won't need to use a wheelchair. So, and I think physiologically a couple of things, but ultimately it'd be extraordinarily liberating to be able to move around in a cabin without any form of standard disability that she has, let alone actually walking, or not walking, or potentially moving around on a lunar surface, which doesn't, I mean, the situation is gravity is the worst enemy in this particular situation. So that's just a decision to do it. And I think that decision's pretty straightforward. There's always consequences. No one, you put these superhumans up onto space, there's a huge amount of screening and expense of doing that. But there's also risk associated with anything. And this is where some of the decisions need to be made, that you may have risk, and that's okay. It'd be horrible to be in a situation where you're halfway to Mars and find out that you've basically got a sore leg and you've got an osteosarcoma sitting in one of your bones. Well, you're probably not going to come home. It's going to be pretty tricky, but that's all about sort of forward thinking, I suppose. But biggest decision is, let's just do it. Like, just do it.
It was wonderful a few years back to see Stephen Hawking, who was extremely disabled, go on a parabolic flight, and you can sort of see the joy on his face with being able to have that sort of moment of microgravity, and just what a great pleasure it was. So if we can do it for Stephen Hawking, surely we can do it for anyone. Thank you.
And just to add to that, in general, I think we really are trying to overcome 60 years worth of what NASA has defined to be an astronaut. And so the mentality needs to switch. You have to have that diversity there. And what has been noted as disabilities here are not going to be disabilities as you increase altitude and lessen your gravity. So I think the key now is to assume that there are no real constraints, and instead use technology and to be able to then help bridge whatever medical gap there may be there to enable everyone. So it's just my personal belief.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, great point.
Well, Lisa stole my personal belief. So a little, JFK said, the hazards of space are hostile to us all. And I think that applies not just to, countries going into space, but also civilization. The hazards are going to be the same whether you're abled or disabled, and being able to address those from a technical perspective help lessen that barrier to entry to spaceflight. Speaking of like bureaucracy and how that ends up killing opportunity. So in 2011, I started at NASA as an intern, and they wouldn't even let me put on a spacesuit at the time because of my diabetes. And I had to fight because they were using Air Force fighter pilot standards for their spacesuit screening. So I had to actually fight the man a little bit, and was able to be the first diabetic to wear a spacesuit. And now we do it all the time. And I think the fact that we now have this emerging market where you have commercial companies that are very influenced by doing the right thing for disability inclusion, that they're looking at those standards and understanding that some of them may be a little bit ridiculous. You look at the Inspiration 4, they have their own medical program, their own medical protocols, and they allowed someone with a prosthesis to fly in space. And I think that's the flexibility that we have to have, both as nation states that are launching astronauts, as well as commercial companies that are looking to do that. And then the side effect of that is you now are really having a more representative segment of your population share in that experience, which is, if we're going to be a spacefaring civilization versus a spacefaring subset of people, that's what you have to be able to do to allow access for all. Maybe it won't happen in my lifetime, but maybe in my children or my grandchildren's lifetime, we will have civilizations in space. And it's only by allowing that foundational inclusion and diversity of thought and experience that we'll be able to do that as something that's representative of the people here on Earth. So I think it's great that we are seeing these nonprofit, commercial, and even in government-sponsored efforts with ESA's para-astronaut program to begin pushing those boundaries, because for the longest time it didn't happen. And as someone who's had to fight a lot of those standards, I'm extremely appreciative of the work that people stood behind me, doctors stood behind me, were able to break down some of those barriers to allow me to experience those things professionally. So again, I think space is for us all, and I think we have to be realistic about what the risks are. I understand if you're flying an F-18, maybe you can't touch the rudder pedals if you don't have legs, but maybe that standard doesn't apply to someone who's going and doing a spacewalk. We have to be very careful and deliberate about the job task analysis of an astronaut, which is kind of the wording that America uses for the Americans with Disabilities Act, is to understand what is actually part of the job and how can we tailor that to open up the aperture on who can participate.
Well, thank you. Those are really interesting insights to have, and I'm really glad to hear that progress has been made and that you personally were able to drive some of that change. And I think it's often that fear of something going wrong, rather than thinking about what might go right, that can hold things back. And I've done a bit of research into the whole health side of commercial space flight, and And initially there was a lot of worry about would ordinary people be able to tolerate the stresses of a short suborbital flight. And there are a series of studies that the US FAA did with people from about 18 to about 80 with common medical conditions in a centrifuge. And most people actually tolerated it really well. And that gave them a lot of confidence that this was something that we could actually go ahead with.
Yeah, I think humans are a lot more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. So it's very encouraging to see the scientific proof of that. Dr. Blue, I think, is one of the authors on that. And she's doing a lot of work with diabetics and cardiac patients to look at opening up the screening, the FAA screening for those suborbital flights. And that's some of the work that NASA has been deeply involved with as we see commercial space flights starting to open up. You know, that wave is happening whether we're part of it or not. We have to make sure that we're applying the right logic, the right requirements, and being part of the solution, not part of the problem.
It's kind of been heartening too to see that they've had people from 18 years old to 90 years old who've actually flown on suborbital flights and have had a great time with no adverse consequences. So I think that's very encouraging in terms of the whole concept of opening up space more widely to humans generally. Dr. Blue has certainly done an amazing body of research, made a huge contribution. It must be really exciting to be there on the ground and interacting with all of that. Well, very, very much for those answers. And that sort of segues into our next topic, which is looking at the kind of harder side of space, that there's always going to be ethical questions associated with it, and commercial spaceflight in particular. The huge costs of participating are actually limit severely the number of people who can participate just for financial reasons. And it's quite common to also see criticism that why is all this money being spent on what's essentially tourism activities when we've got all the issues with climate change and we've got famine in Africa, and shouldn't we be doing more to deal with our problems here on Earth? Obviously, you can do research on suborbital flights, which is a really good thing, but there's still this ethical tension between the cost and the benefit. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we might be able to leverage that in a way that still allows the boundaries of exploration to be pushed, but at the same time feed some tangible benefits back to the areas on Earth that really need those sort of amounts of money to fix the problems that we have. And I know that's kind of a hard question. It's a very philosophical question, but I'd be really interested to hear if you have any thoughts about that.
You guys weren't holding back the softball questions. No, so I think there's always even back during Apollo, there was questions of why are we spending all this money to go to the moon when we have Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, we have the war in Vietnam, you have all this stuff going on. Today commercial interests, they're going to space whether you want to be part of it or not, right? It's their prerogative with their money and their support. But I see that going to space, even William Shatner, when he did his suborbital flight, you think people that are participating in these, while they may be the super wealthy, they are getting perspective on our fragile Earth, and they're acting as ambassadors to that. And my hope is that this is a phase, just like space has evolved over time from only 2 nation states doing space now into commercial. This is the opening wave of being able to have an entire civilization looking at space flight. Those ethical questions of spending the money on space flight versus climate change, I think we have to look at the fact that we are using space to help combat some of those challenges. And I'll keep any personal beliefs to myself, but it's one of those things where we have to understand these activities are going to be happening, and we have to make sure that we can partner best with those activities to achieve those end goals. Talking about flying experiments on these opportunities, in reality, it's really reduced the cost of access to space. Even even though it may be the very super rich that are flying, it is much cheaper to fly to space on a commercial spacecraft now than it ever was prior. And hopefully over time, that's an exponential drop in price where it really does become open to anyone that can afford it on a modest fee. I hope I'm answering the question a little bit, but I definitely feel that tension where we have to solve the problems we have here on Earth. But what better way to get perspective on that than to see the Earth in its entirety and be able to have something that's inspirational and aspirational, such as a moon program, to be able to focus our efforts, our good efforts, to go expand humanity's presence in this system.
Those some really great insights. Appreciate that.
To add to that, what I'm thinking is that NASA in particular has always had to embrace this dichotomy of, why do we have a budget that will send people upward, but working on research when there are so many social challenges here, on Earth today. And so the biggest thing that I think comes out of NASA in particular is of all the necessity that it takes to enable space flight, to enable anything that get you off of the Earth, results in technology never been done before. It's necessity actually turns into innovation, invention. And then, of course, it reaches back into society with spinoffs. And so NASA is very, very proud of all of the spinoffs. It's innumerable, the number of spinoffs that have come out of NASA in particular, that goes right into the medical field, for example. But it also goes into the common household. So Velcro, for example, I could just keep going down the list, but NASA actually puts out spinoffs every year that will tout everything that it works on and how it benefits humanity. And so to me, this is just an extension of all of that. We're going to now see the new challenges, which will then have to result in new technology that then answers the challenge. But then that is going to spin off into things that we can't even imagine that is going to benefit humanity. So that's how I'm looking at the ethical part. And I actually am very proud of NASA and all the spinoffs that come out that do benefit humanity.
And that's a really good point. And NASA has just made a huge contribution in so many different areas with the spin-offs. And for members of the audience, you might not be aware, but NASA actually has a section of its website devoted to spin-offs and puts out an annual publication about the spin-offs which has happened during the course of that particular year. And you can search the whole archive, and it's really a fascinating and wonderful experience to have a look through that and realize what an immense contribution NASA has made. So thank you very much for mentioning that. Bruce, we're back to you, I'm afraid.
Oh, here we go. And listening to this, when the question was answered, oh, okay, this is the answer I think I'll give. And then my other two panelists, I might change my answer. Well, let me think about it. So there's no right answer, which is really, really tricky. Couple of things, the cliches that fit in my head very much so, be curious, not judgmental. So it's very easy for us to make a judgment to say, why are you spending all this money when the depth of poverty that's around the world at the moment probably could actually be resolved with the amount of money that we spend in space exploration. But at the end of the day, that's probably not necessarily the right answer as well. So I might sort of go down the economic path. I would be very surprised if every dollar that NASA spent on space exploration hasn't been returned in multiples with the various spin-offs that have actually been done. So if you want to go down an economic approach, then it probably makes a whole lot of sense. The same with medical research. I know in Australia that every dollar we spend on medical research actually returns about 2.5. I find it very interesting that we don't spend more money on it because, let's face it, if I put $10 and I get 25 back, I mean, this is kind of a good deal, keep going. So at the end of the day, it eventually has beginnings and ends. What's been interesting now is that ultimately there's now private money and private equity going into this, and it's a fundamentally different construct. and we're probably in a slightly uncharted waters, but we also actually have now access to revenue that we never had before. And so I can only see that as a good thing. But for us as ultimately as a society, space is about hope, and we definitely need that. We definitely need to be able to be in a situation where, I know JFK said, I want to put a person on the moon. I don't know how to do it yet, but we're going to work it out. If we didn't have that view in medical research, nothing would happen. So there would be no cures. There would be, nothing would happen where, look, we need to actually cure cancer. If you don't start asking that question, it won't happen. If you don't ask the question of, I want to cure asthma, it just won't happen. So the good thing about the space situation is that ultimately we want to go there. We don't know how to do it yet, but we'll work it out. And all the benefits associated with that IP, I suppose, is immeasurable.
Thank you. Really good point.
Yeah, I echo your point about good answer, good answer. Oh no, it's swap the answers. I was going to say the same thing again, but I'll pivot. So I think I had like two. Thank you for taking the inclusion piece for me. I'm sitting here with carbon titanium attached to my limbs. Those technologies did not come from just time on Earth. It came from thinking about how to build strong materials for spaceships and how to keep it lighter and how to get it up above ground. With regards to commercialization of space, the price per kg has dropped down to about, I think, 8,000 something per kg. You can thank SpaceX or something like that, but before it used to be about 20 plus kgs, which means it makes more sense to send people with simple skills up there rather than having every skill in the world, which then reduces the changing of the right stuff. But with regards to exploration and how that actually improves inclusion, that's been our history. That's absolutely a history. The British did not go everywhere, and what's the UK's current favorite food? It's chicken tikka masala. So is that, as humans, you want to think about that stuff. Exploration has always been what makes the world a more inclusive place. And it used to be ships, it used to be, boats. It's a different vehicle. So it's a little bit further, but these technologies, you need to go further out to actually improve things over here. Many of us got over here using GPS satellites, followed our phones. That's these guys and the work that they've done. And so you need to keep going further to make the world a more inclusive place. Racism, though, becomes very hard if you don't fix it before you leave. Because you think racism is bad right now. Wait till it's interplanetary and someone decides I can hurl an asteroid at a planet. That's, future thinking. You can do that, but that's the type of stuff that you want to think about now before you leave. So you want to make it as inclusive as possible that everybody going up and everybody staying here are the same people. Sure, we're going to get affected differently by radiations and gravity and other elements out there, but as long as we have the same mindset, you really want to fix that before you leave. And right now, people leaving is through this small hollow tube. So make sure that that tube is accessible and inclusive and can take as many, as diverse people as possible. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think there's some really good points to come out of that, the things that feed back from going into space are of enormous benefit to people here on Earth and have been through the whole 60-year history of human space flight. And also in terms of going to space, we need to be thinking about being representative of all human beings and not just the right stuff. We need to move forward from that. And through the opening up of space, that does give us an opportunity to do that, even though it's early days at the moment and it's mainly sort of rich people who are doing that. Hopefully in the fullness of time that will enable a much broader pool of people to go. And that leads into the last topic, which is actually a topic that I've been researching and talking about a lot myself, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts about it. And that is if humans are going to be a spacefaring civilization, one of the things which we need to talk about that is currently pretty much an elephant in the room is the whole issue of human reproduction in space and At the moment, they're just rodent studies, so mice and rats, because it's, for obvious reasons, it's considered unethical to research these issues on humans, and pregnant people aren't allowed to go into space. But if we are thinking about building civilizations on other worlds, it is something that we need to think about, because otherwise you can't sustain your civilization. So I'm just interested to know if you have any thoughts about what you see as the big challenges, both from the point of view of the adults, because it obviously starts with the adults, but also in terms of the offspring and sort of trying to birth children and bring them up in these extreme environments with different gravity fields and very isolated and confined settings. So I know that's sort of another hard question, but at the same time, I'm just interested to know if you have any thoughts about that.
I absolutely love that you're asking a guy who runs an online company this particular question, but it's not unheard of. But what is it in the space? You're probably the expert in this area, and I'll hand to you shortly. But at least on the panel in this area. But we're evolved to to grow up here on Earth, right? 1G. That's how we've evolved in this space over here. And there is research done by I think one of the founders of Geospace, where cancer cells do not transmit in a 0G environment, which means gestation periods are likely to be a similar situation. It might be a little bit harder. Pregnancy might be a completely different thing in a 0G environment. I think we definitely need an element of gravity, and I suspect Martian gravity might be enough to make it happen. Lunar gravity, maybe not so much, which means that if you're going to send civilization, you've got to send a lot of people, and you keep sending people for a civilization to kind of exist. And that's a 2.5-year journey or something of that nature at this stage. And for humans to kind of evolve elsewhere, it's gonna take some time. It might be generations. But that's my high level thinking on it from someone who's just wants to get himself up there and at least get 3 days in space. That's all I need. And I'll come back down to Earth. But over to someone a little bit smarter than me.
Oh, okay. This is tricky. Reproduction's not my thing in terms of the study of it. So there's probably breaking the whole thing down. The construct of someone becomes pregnant while they're doing a trip for a period of 6-12 months or whatever it's going to be. It's going to happen probably one day. And so that's a little tricky in terms of, say, nationality. Well, there's actually rules about this. Kim and I were talking about it last night. If you actually have a baby while you're on a plane in international airspace, then the nationality of that child is going to be the person from the parents of where they actually came from and what their passports say. A little bit different. You don't necessarily have border control when you actually roll up to the moon, so not quite sure how that's going to work. The second aspect of it is actually having a civilization in orbit, which is probably much more realistic at this point in time in probably 1 or 2 generations, as opposed to actually having a civilization actually on deck on the moon or on another planet. So in that particular case, then you start having to ask hard questions, because giving birth is not necessarily a straightforward thing to do, and how much of infrastructure, how much of sort of an infrastructure would you have wrapped around that? And that's where it could be highly controversial and be really tough if we're going to be doing suborbital flights for, or not, basically burning around the moon in its orbit for some period of time, then actually forms of contraception and that sort of stuff just don't go there, So that would probably reduce the risk. But at some point, if you're going to be there for a long period of time, and in terms of years, because we've actually set up shop there, which is probably quite a few lifetimes away, then these questions will start to be answered. And yes, all the physiological responses to gestation in a microgravity environment need to be asked, and that's going to be quite expensive to find out. So we really are playing God, as they say, when we're starting to discuss this. At some point we need to discuss it, but we're very, very early in that picture, I would have thought. I'll let my great-grandchildren sort that out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think honestly, this one's so far out of my lane, I really don't know what to say.
It's okay.
It's really about space-based environmental considerations, the level of radiation, for example, things that you don't think about here that would have to be considered in this more in transit is my guess as well, that this would be occurring in. And so a lot of this is probably just going to be experimental. There's only so much we can do here on Earth. Now, granted, NASA has a lot of experience with longer durations, at the space station. So we do have a little bit of an early handle on radiation concerns. But when you have mutations like that because of the radiation, this is a tough one. What do you do? And I honestly don't have an answer, and think I'm going to pass this on and see if my colleague has an answer instead.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you never thought my boss would be passing the microphone to talk about that. Yeah, so I have 2 kids. I don't know if I'd want to bring them on a trip to Mars, but yeah, so this is a really interesting question that we're gonna have to phase at some point. I do agree with Bruce that this is a multi-generational from now type issue, but it brings up the interesting question, if folks are doing commercial tourism around the moon and someone does get pregnant and they come back and there's birth defects and issues like that, how do we treat those? How do we address those? But I think the biggest thing is that there's a lot of technical risk to the reproduction from the radiation environment, as Lisa mentioned. And that's something that we have to get smarter on, because if we are serious about being a multiplanetary species, we've got to understand the environment. And, heaven forbid that we can't reproduce as a society because of that environment. And at least it would be good to know that now versus when we're in the midst of trying to colonize a planet. So that, I guess I'm going to be like everyone else, a big question mark. And we just got to figure out and focus on the next 10 years to get us started on this journey, knowing that these issues are going to be out there. I think you're going to run into, in my opinion, from a policy perspective, it's the citizenship issue, and especially if you have some space station where someone was born, do they belong? Are they a citizen of the country whose space station it was? What if it was a commercial space station? How does that all work out? Even if we're going to the moon, Mars, where there is no sovereignty yet, and how does that all play into it? So, big ethical issues to be thinking about, and big policy issues that people much smarter than me can figure out, and I'll just play by the rules. So, thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for contributing your thoughts. I know that was a challenging question to ask, but at the same time, I think it's important that we do think about these issues and start talking about them, because if we don't start talking about them now, then when we're actually ready to start doing something about it, we won't be ready in terms of the physiological issues, the legal issues, which you've highlighted really nicely, that there need to be frameworks around citizenship and those sort of things, and also just all the ethical considerations because of the risk of things from radiation and from exposure to the microgravity environment.
And one issue that's interesting is, the idea of radiation exposure and the human effects. We're still learning a lot. So if a female or a male flew on a long duration mission and they had different physiological responses, and then they were unable to bear children later on and they got back to Earth, do they now have a workman's comp issue with NASA that said, hey, I was exposed to an occupational hazard that now prevents me from having children? So those are some of the other legal issues that may pop up, that you were exposed to something in the course of your occupation as an astronaut that now prevents you from having children or impacts your reproductive system that we may have to address in the future.
Understanding that you're an astronaut, you almost find something to suggest you're not going to
astronaut, so I don't know.
So I presume there must be sort of a waiver of subject matter.
So the astronauts are given longitudinal health studies. So basically they're monitored for the rest of their lives after their space flights to look for some of those markers. But I don't know of any kind of the legal waiver. I know for a commercial space flight, if you fly on a fully commercial US chartered mission, like with Inspiration 4, you do sign an indemnity waiver that says whatever happens. Yeah.
That's actually a really good point about preparing for the possibility that you may end up infertile because of the exposure to radiation, for instance. And I have read in some of the articles that there is the capacity there if people want to freeze eggs or freeze ovarian tissue or sperm before they go on an extended mission, that's something that they can do just to protect their ability to have children once they've completed their mission. But I think that's a really important consideration to bring into the discussion, that you make sure that you cover all the bases and prepare for your own future situation with regard to your reproductive preferences. I think we are pretty much on time, which is wonderful. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you for your generous and open contributions to the discussion questions today. I know I asked some difficult questions, so I really appreciate you addressing those and sharing your thoughts. And I would like to invite the audience to thank our panelists well. So can we give them a big round of applause?